I remember the rain that night in Seattle, a relentless gray curtain against the hospital windows. He arrived at 2 a.m, a ghost of a man with eyes that had seen too much, and a body broken in ways the charts couldn't fully explain. They called him a John Doe found near the docks, but his posture, even while semi-conscious, suggested a discipline that didn't belong to a drifter. My name is Evelyn, and after 12 years in the trauma ward, I've learned that the loudest patients are rarely the ones in the most danger. This man was silent, a vacuum of sound in a chaotic ER. When the resident tried to administer a standard dose of morphine for his shattered femur, the man's hand shot out like a serpent, gripping the doctor's wrist with terrifying strength. "No drugs," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. He was trembling, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. Yet his refusal was absolute. We were baffled. The pain should have been terminal, yet he chose to face it wide awake. I watched him closely as we wheeled him to the 4th floor, wondering what kind of ghost prefers the sting of reality to the comfort of oblivion. If this story has hooked you so far, subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. The second day was a battle of wills between the surgical team and a patient who refused to yield. Dr. Aris was furious, insisting that we couldn't perform the necessary debridement without heavy sedation, but the man simply stared at the ceiling, his jaw locked tight. I was the one tasked with cleaning the lacerations on his arms. As I peeled back the blood-soaked gauze, I expected to see standard road rash or puncture wounds. Instead, as I dipped the sponge into the saline, I noticed something peculiar on the backs of his hands and across his knuckles. There were faint, stippled patterns, dark, peppering marks embedded deep under the skin. My heart skipped a beat as I realized they weren't dirt or bruises. They were gunpowder burns, the kind you get from the blowback of a high-caliber rifle. He saw me looking, and for a split second, the mask of the stoic patient slipped, revealing a predatory sharpness that made the air in the room feel heavy. He didn't say a word, but he pulled his hand away, tucking it under the thin hospital sheet. I realized then that I wasn't just nursing a victim. I was looking after someone who lived by the trigger. Thank you for staying with me this far. This shows you feel the same way I felt when I lived all of this. So subscribe and hit the bell, because what comes now changes everything. The atmosphere in the ward shifted after that discovery, becoming thick with an unspoken tension. I kept my findings to myself, not out of loyalty, but out of a sudden, inexplicable curiosity about the man in bed 4. While the rest of the nursing staff complained about his difficult nature, I saw the way he scanned the room every time the door opened, his eyes measuring exits and checking shadows. He was an apex predator in a paper gown. Late that evening, while the city lights of Seattle flickered through the mist, I returned to check his vitals. His heart rate was skyrocketing, a clear sign of the agony he was suppressing. Yet he didn't even moan. "Why the silence?" I asked softly, adjusting his IV drip of simple saline. "Pain is information," he whispered, finally looking at me. "If I sleep, I lose the edge, and I can't afford to be blunt right now." It was a chilling admission that confirmed my suspicions. He wasn't avoiding the morphine because of an allergy or a past addiction. He was staying awake because he was expecting someone to come through that door, and it wasn't a friend. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it down in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. The morning he disappeared was the quietest the ward had been in weeks. I walked into room 402 with his morning antibiotics, only to find an empty, perfectly made bed. There was no trace of the man who had survived the impossible without a single drop of morphine. The only thing left behind was a small folded piece of paper on the nightstand with a single word written in a precise military hand: gratitude. I never reported the gunpowder burns to the authorities. Some might call it a breach of ethics, but in the gray world of nursing, you learn that some wounds aren't meant to be healed by medicine, and some secrets are better left in the shadows of the hospital corridors. He taught me that resilience isn't just about enduring pain. It's about holding on to your soul when the world tries to numb you into submission. I still look at the news from my old home in Boston, wondering if I'll see a face that matches those cold, disciplined eyes. But for now, he is just another ghost in a career filled with them. And if you stayed with me until this final moment, write the word resilience to prove you heard the whole story, and to show that you understand the true strength of the human spirit. The silence of the night shift is never truly silent. It is a symphony of hums from monitors and the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. By the fourth day, the atmosphere around room 402 had changed from curiosity to a heavy, localized dread. I noticed two men in charcoal suits standing near the elevators, their eyes scanning every nurse who passed by with a cold, predatory efficiency. They didn't look like family, and they certainly didn't look like police. In the break room, the gossip was reaching a fever pitch. My colleague, Sarah, whispered about how the patient's records were being flagged by a federal agency she couldn't name. I kept my mouth shut about the gunpowder burns I had seen, but my heart hammered against my ribs every time I had to enter his room. When I walked in to check his drainage bag, he was sitting bolt upright, staring at the closed door. The television was off, the lights were dimmed, and the only sound was his ragged, unmedicated breathing. He looked at me, not as a patient looks at a caretaker, but as a soldier looks at a scout. He knew they were there. He knew the perimeter was closing in. I realized then that my hospital had become a fortress, and I was caught right in the middle of a war I didn't understand. The air felt charged with static, the kind that precedes a massive lightning strike. It happened during the 3 a.m. slump, that hour where the veil between life and death seems thinnest in the hospital. I was adjusting his pillows when he finally spoke more than a sentence. His voice was a dry rattle, strained by the Herculean effort of resisting the pain that radiated from his hip. "They think I'm a monster," he said, staring at the moonlight filtering through the blinds. I paused, the pillowcase still in my hands. "I don't know what you are," I replied honestly. "I just know you're a man who's hurting." He let out a short, bitter laugh that ended in a wince. He told me about a life lived in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where he was trained to be a ghost with a rifle. He spoke of a mission that went wrong, not because of a missed shot, but because of a moral choice he hadn't expected to make. He was refusing the morphine because he needed to remember the faces of those he couldn't save. He believed that if he let the drugs dull the physical pain, he would lose the weight of the guilt that kept him human. It was a staggering revelation. This wasn't a criminal hiding from justice. It was a man performing a penance of agony. For the first time, I didn't see a threat. I saw a soul that was trying to burn itself clean through sheer endurance. The tension escalated when I caught a senior administrator, a man I had rarely seen on the clinical floors, hovering near the nurses' station late at night. He was reviewing Bed 4's digital chart with an intensity that seemed personal. When he saw me approaching, he closed the tablet abruptly and offered a polite, yet utterly hollow smile. "Just ensuring our high-profile guest is receiving top-tier care," he said, but his eyes stayed cold. Later that shift, I found a small, sophisticated listening device tucked behind the heart monitor in the patient's room. My blood turned to ice. Someone within the very walls of this institution, someone with keys and credentials, was monitoring his every word. I didn't tell the administrator. Instead, I walked over to the patient and squeezed his hand. A silent signal. He looked at the monitor, then back at me. A sharp nod of understanding passing between us. The hospital, a place meant for healing and sanctuary, had been compromised. I felt a wave of nausea. I was no longer just a nurse. I was an accidental accomplice in a high-stakes game of espionage. I had to decide if I would follow the rules of the hospital or the rules of my own conscience. The line between professional duty and human morality was beginning to blur into a dangerous shade of gray. To understand the man in the bed, I had to look back at the life I had left behind in Boston. During a quiet moment, I shared a story of my own, about the cold winters near the harbor and the secrets that families in those old brick neighborhoods kept for generations. His eyes softened at the mention of the Atlantic coast. He revealed he had spent years in the shadows of the North End, working for people who traded in silence and lead. He described the architecture of the old city with a vividness that made me ache for home, but he spoke of it as a place he could never return to. He had been a cleaner, a man brought in to resolve impossible situations with a single long-range shot. But his last job in Boston had involved a target that changed everything, a young woman who knew too much about a corrupt senator. He had chosen to walk away, to let her live, and in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. The gunpowder burns on his hands weren't from a crime. They were from the desperate firefight that occurred when his own people turned on him. He lived a controversial life, one filled with violence. Yet in that one moment of defiance, he had found a spark of redemption. It made me realize that even the darkest paths can have a turning point. The clock hit 4:12 a.m. when the power flickered and the emergency lights kicked in with a dull red glow. I was at the medication cart when I heard the heavy thud of a door hitting a wall. I ran toward room 402. Inside, a man dressed in a generic janitor's uniform was struggling with my patient. The intruder had a pillow pressed over the man's face, attempting to finish what the previous injuries hadn't. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded my system. I didn't think about hospital policy or my own safety. I grabbed a heavy metal IV pole and swung it with every ounce of strength I possessed. The blow caught the intruder across the shoulders, knocking him off balance. My patient, despite his shattered leg, managed to drive an elbow into the man's throat. The intruder scrambled up and fled into the red-tinted darkness of the hallway before security could arrive. When the guards finally showed up, I stood there trembling, the IV pole still gripped in my white-knuckled hands. My patient was gasping for air, but he looked at me with a respect I will never forget. I had a choice then. I could report the full truth of the attack, or I could protect the man who was now more than just a patient. I chose the latter, telling security it was a confused drifter looking for drugs. The aftermath of the attack was a blur of paperwork and hushed conversations with the chief of surgery. I was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but I didn't care. I spent my last few hours of the shift sitting by the bed of the man with the gunpowder hands. We didn't speak much. The silence between us was now one of shared trauma and mutual protection. He looked weaker, the strain of the physical fight having taken a toll on his healing body, yet his eyes remained as sharp as ever. I realized that my life as a nurse would never be the same. I had crossed a line that most professionals never even see. I had protected a killer because I saw the man beneath the scars, and in doing so, I had found a strength in myself I didn't know existed. As the sun began to rise over the Seattle skyline, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gold, I felt a strange sense of peace. The world is full of controversy and pain, and my job was often to just hold the hand of those passing through it. He reached out and gripped my forearm, his pulse steady and strong against my skin. "Go home, Evelyn," he whispered. "You've done enough." I knew then that his time in my care was coming to an end. The morning he disappeared was the quietest the ward had been in weeks. I walked into room 402 with his morning antibiotics, only to find an empty, perfectly made bed. There was no trace of the man who had survived the impossible without a single drop of morphine. The only thing left behind was a small folded piece of paper on the nightstand with a single word written in a precise military hand: gratitude. I never reported the gunpowder burns to the authorities. Some might call it a breach of ethics, but in the gray world of nursing, you learn that some wounds aren't meant to be healed by medicine, and some secrets are better left in the shadows of the hospital corridors. He taught me that resilience isn't just about enduring pain. It's about holding on to your soul when the world tries to numb you into submission. I still look at the news from my old home in Boston, wondering if I'll see a face that matches those cold, disciplined eyes. But for now, he is just another ghost in a career filled with them. And if you stayed with me until this final moment, write the word resilience to prove you heard the whole story and to show that you understand the true strength of the human spirit.